Okay, it's wonderful to be here at the Newcastle Writers Festival to introduce these wonderful women. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we speak and pay my respects to elders past and present. And here we have some elders of, I think, the women's movement in Australia, regardless of their actual chronological age. On my far right here is Sara Mansour, who is a recent law graduate and co-founder of Bankstown Poetry Slam. Nick, can we welcome Sara? Next to, Sara, not Sarah. Sara, Jane, get it right. You can just call me Janay, if you like, it's revenge. Next to her is Tara Moss. Tara, of course, is the author of 9 novels published in 18 countries in 11 languages, which is a huge achievement. These include the Mac van der Waal crime series, starring her feminist crime-fighting heroine. She's also written 2 non-fiction books, The Fictional Woman and Speaking Out, a 21st century handbook for women and girls. She's also the host and co-exec producer and writer of the doco Cyber Hate that aired on ABC last month. Please welcome Tara. On my left is Tracey Spicer, who is a journalist, broadcaster and author, and her memoir, The Girl Stripped Bare, is being published by HarperCollins on April 24, so very soon. Her new business, which is very appropriate for our panel topic, is called Outspoken Women and is aimed at amplifying women's voices. You've already welcomed Tracey, so we won't waste precious time doing it again. We will move smartly to Emily Maguire, who is the author of 5 novels, including An Isolated Incident, which is shortlisted for the Stella, isn't it? It is. Which is a wonderful achievement. She's also written 2 non-fiction feminist manifestos for teens and young women, so we couldn't have a better qualified panel to discuss this topic. My only claim is that I've physically... I was going to make another lost voice joke, I'll just let that one go. How we're going to run this panel is I'm going to get each of the panellists, starting with Emily and working across the room, to speak for a few minutes to the topic. And then we'll have a general conversation up here about the themes that emerge from what they say. And then I will throw the floor open to you. I notice that we have 2 mics for your questions. I would appreciate questions, and I do get a bit school-marmy about you going on about something you've got to be in your bonnet about. Do that at the book signing, okay? Because we're short of time, we want to hear from these fabulous women. There you are, don't say you weren't warned. All right, we will begin with Emily on the importance of women's voices.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. It's great to see such a big crowd for this event. I'm really primed on this topic because I happen to be working at the moment on a big non-fiction project that's about the history of feminist activism in Australia. And what I've realised as I've been working on that the history of feminist activism and the women's movement is a history of women demanding that their voices are heard, starting, well, in the big first significant post-colonial feminist event in Australia, which was the getting of the vote for women, so our voices are heard in the democracy, women being able to stand for parliament, but also victories in women actually being able to be heard by medical science and the healthcare system, particularly in relation to our own bodies and to pregnancy and to reproduction, women being able to be heard by the justice system and by law enforcement about what the experience is for women in their own homes and on the streets and being able to be safe, women being able to be heard as educators and as workers, and in every single context, each of these battles has been about, you got to listen to us about our experiences and make some changes based on that. And the other thing I've noticed is there's all these incredible women leaders who have worked so hard at every stage of the way to win these victories for all of us. And they are not nearly celebrated enough. We should be learning their names in school alongside all the other kind of political and historical figures, most of whom are men. But all that said, the stories that keep drawing me back into all this research are actually of the hundreds of thousands of women whose names aren't recorded and who are in no way celebrated and who were never destined to be feminist heroines, but who nevertheless actually formed the movement, formed this swell of pressure which the leaders of the movement could then corral into legislative change. Because it was all these women who, unnamed, uncelebrated, signed the petitions, turned up at the marches, went on strike, participated in the boycotts, wrote the letters, and in a lot of cases simply held small, often really informal meetings in their work break rooms or in their kitchens, winning hearts and minds one by one, almost speaking up about this stuff. And then in each of these victories has been won for women in a legislative sense. It's the women who are running the reproductive health and abortion clinics, the women who are running the refuges, the ones who are working in healthcare and educating and standing up for women's autonomy of their bodies. All of these kind of nameless women who are not extraordinary in the sense that they're going to be celebrated in any great history books, but without them there's no movement and there's no reinforcement of the legislative wins. And so as I've been doing this, I've realised that this is actually something that I'm coming to know about myself, that it is always these stories I'm drawn to in all of my novels as well. So in this latest one, An Isolated Incident, the main character is a really ordinary woman. She's not particularly brilliant or gorgeous or even ambitious. Like, her greatest ambition is to maybe save up a house deposit in her little country town, to get laid every now and then, and to be able to hang out with her friends and her sister. That's her life that she wants. And an extraordinarily terrible event happens to her, which is her sister is murdered. And she's kind of thrust into the national spotlight with people wanting her to be some kind of advocate or voice for this movement. And that's not her. And she is really bad when she tries to do that, so she mostly doesn't, and reacts in ways that other people might find inappropriate. But I feel with her that because she is not able to take on that role and doesn't want to, it doesn't mean she doesn't care about or understand issues of violence against women, even before and beyond what's happened to her sister. Because she's like most women in that she understands more than anyone should have to about violence against women and how it works and how it happens in the privacy of homes and in private spaces. And she's been, in a way, dealing with it all her life and supporting other women and helping them and figuring out how to deal with it. And that is the bulk of women. We deal with this shit all the time in these little ways and supporting and bolstering each other. And when I think about the importance of women's voices, yes, we need leaders and we need strong people to speak out and be the first in line to celebrate those women and those voices. But for me, I'm always drawn back into this bulk of other voices, the people who are sometimes described as voiceless, because they're not, because they're talking to each other and supporting each other on a community level all the time. And I think maybe it is that we as a culture are not great at listening to them, but those voices are still there.
Tracey.
Well put, Em. To follow on from what you were saying, women's voices have historically been silenced and women's histories forgotten. I'd just like to read a very brief passage from my book, except I forgot my glasses, so I'll have to lengthen my arms. For centuries, threats have been used to silence women. In her lecture, "Oh, do shut up, dear," classicist Mary Beard draws a line from Homer's Odyssey in which Penelope is told, "Speech will be the business of men," to contemporary mocking of women commentators. From the philosopher Aristotle, who said silence is a woman's glory, to 17th century Americans submerging scolds on ducking stools, we're told to shut the fuck up. One of my first memories as a child is being told to sit there, be a good girl and be quiet. And I think that probably replicates a lot of memories of the women in particular in this room. I then went on, despite that, to be a journalist. And one of my first jobs was at a radio station in Melbourne, where we were told explicitly, even though I was the 24-hour on-call police reporter, to never do a story on the code 10 that I would hear at the scanner next to my bed every night. I said to the boss one day, "What is this code 10 and why don't we cover it?" He said, "Oh, that's just a domestic incident. What goes on behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. It's none of our business." It's a private matter. Just some guy giving a woman the back of his hand. They are the words of my news director at that time. So I was horrified, and it taught me that it's not only we privileged women up here who have our voices silenced as women commentators, it's women behind closed doors being bashed every day, whose voices have been silenced for centuries, let's face it. I then went on from radio to television and discovered that even in tiny ways that really seem, a little bit pointless, complaining about, the male anchor will always read the intro to the first story before the female co-anchor. And even when I was 24 years of age, I knew that that was wrong, because it was, my male co-anchor at the time was an ex-model and I was a journalist, but he was the one who had the gravitas, the testicles, the authority to read the first story every night. So I went up and complained to the news director, and we alternated. It's just a small thing, but I think what we do in the media really has to reflect the way women's voices should have 50% of the space in society. Now, I'm very privileged to be in a position as National Convener of Women in Media, where we've done a lot of research on women's voices in radio, television, newspaper and online. I was actually saddened to read the Sun Herald over breakfast this morning, because John Westacott, an old television executive, one of those dinosaurs, said about 10 years ago, "You need your blokes to do the stories in the first break. The big swinging dicks, they're the ones who do the stories about politics and business and the serious matters of crime. Women do the stories in the second and third breaks, the health stories, the family stories, the consumer stories." So I go through, as a little bit of personal research, the Sun Herald this morning, and the first 10 pages, it's only men covering business and politics, and it's all women covering consumer, fashion, health, and one story on sexual assault. And I thought, shit, how far have we really come? So our research with iSentia a couple of years ago showed that there are still 70% of male voices to 30% of female voices in journalism overall. When I finished my journalism degree in 1985, it was 95% women. It's almost as if a whole generation of women has disappeared. And the reason why this is important is because our research also showed that women journalists are more likely to use women talent in their stories by a factor of 2 to 1 compared with male journalists. So it's all about women amplifying other women's voices. The optimistic part of my rant here, though, is that things are changing dramatically. Jane and I had the great privilege of speaking at a women's march in Sydney last month, which, when they counted the numbers, turned out to be the biggest women's march in the city in a generation. We are really riding this fourth wave. There's an incredible amount of grassroots movement around the world where women are collecting, like they did at the time of the suffragette movement getting us the vote, and joining together to lift each other up. And I think that's incredibly exciting.
Tara.
Where do I begin with this topic? Women's voices matter because we're human beings and we're about 50% of the population. If we want to think of ourselves as a democracy, if we want to think we have equality, we actually need equal representation between the genders, equal representation from various groups in our communities, people of different backgrounds, people of different ethnic minorities. We need all these people actually at the table. And when I say at the table, I mean we need their voices heard, we need their stories heard and remembered, talking about the women from the past who've been literally lost in history because it was not considered important work. We need their voices heard in the media because, as you mentioned, they're more likely to actually draw on other women when you have women writing stories. In Australia today, I think there's about roughly equal numbers of men and women working in journalism, but at least twice as many front-page bylines by male journalists. And again, this is not a uniquely Australian problem. In the UK, they looked at this, and they found something really peculiar that comes out of that disparity. One of the things they found was in front-page articles, again, the vast majority written by male journalists, the vast majority of experts quoted in those front pages were men. And disturbingly, the vast majority of victims quoted on those front pages were women. Now, you can imagine the effect that has on a young person today. Now, any individual story, sure, it can absolutely have a male expert and a female victim. We know that happens. We know that can be appropriate to the story. But the cumulative effect of again and again seeing which of these two categories you belong to, Are you a victim or are you an expert? Because women, of course, are also experts. Men, of course, are also victims, right? But we have this very skewed thing that takes place. So when The Fictional Woman came out in 2014, it was my first foray into nonfiction after having written crime fiction for some time. And I guess taking some of these social justice issues and writing them under a veneer of fiction, doing a lot of research, but kind of having to drop a lot of that. Emily's nodding, she knows what it's like to try to tell those stories and get close to victims of crime and survivors of crime and police officers, and then try to find a way to write that so that people are enjoying entertainment, but also getting a sense of what's happening in the world. And I decided, okay, I'm going to break out of that and I'm going to write this nonfiction book. And what was amazing for me is the number of women and girls in particular who came to me afterwards saying, you know, you're brave. Somehow having a voice as a woman makes you brave. It's not normal still, apparently. And a lot of people ask me, how do I do this? How do I participate? So I basically end The Fictional Woman passing the baton, saying, over to you. I want you to participate in public life. And I had hundreds and hundreds of the same types of questions from thousands of women and girls over about an 18-month period when I was touring around and talking about that book. That's where Speaking Out came from. It's literally a handbook responding to the questions that I had. But of course, because this discussion of women's voices and the importance of women's voices is met immediately with that knee-jerk reaction of like, why? Why do you have to make it gendered? Why does it have to be about women? What about men? Because of that, the first third of the book is literally the why. Why am I focusing on this? Well, the reason it's a handbook for women and girls and aiming to write a particular disparity is because that disparity is documented. We know that women's levels of participation in public life are considerably lower than men's. Even today, yes, even in 2017. So one of the reasons I wrote Speaking Out was because fewer than 1 out of every 4 people we hear from or about in the media is female, worldwide. Fewer than 1 out of every 4. Interestingly, we see this reflected elsewhere. Our cabinet, for example. I remember when I was writing The Fictional Woman, Abbott's first cabinet was 100% white and 95% male. And, you know, that's not so long ago. And they found another woman, and it doubled overnight, and it was like, miracles, it doubled. Equality achieved. No. But with Turnbull's cabinet, there was this discussion in the media about how it was a win for women. I don't know if you remember this, but it was a win for women. Why? Because it's 24% now. So there's still more than 3 men's voices for every 1 woman's. Interesting that it matches that worldwide statistic. And of course, when I bring up worldwide stats like that, I'm often, you know, leveled with the idea like, yeah, but it's not in Australia. We don't have those sorts of stats in Australia. And as Tracey will undoubtedly talk about later in this session as well, we do have those stats in Australia. That's precisely how it's laid out. You still see this sort of 70-something, 80-something% male participation rates, 20, 30, sometimes much less, sometimes 15 or 11% female participation rates in a lot of these public spaces. This is continuing today. And the other thing I think is really interesting about women's voices is the stereotypes that have continued to allow us to not take action on this issue of democracy. Because we hear all the time that women talk a lot. Women are always talking. They can never shut up. Have you heard this one? Women talk constantly. So I thought with Speaking Out in this first third of the book, the why, I would just unpick that a little bit. And I want to share one little part of this. So you've probably heard that women speak about 20,000 more words per day than men. Have you heard that one? Yeah, that one goes around. Okay. This has been picked up by the Daily Mail, by even more reputable newspapers, believe it or not. And actually, when you start to try to dig down and find the stats, there's no citation for it. It doesn't exist because it's made up. It's completely made up as a statistic. And a couple of researchers in the 1990s decided that they would try to figure out what's going on here and actually see what the stats are like. They looked at 63 studies about the amount of talk by men and women in various contexts and found that in 61 of the studies, men talked more. Right? That's not all men, that's not all women, that's not all the time. But clearly this idea that women do all this talking, that men can't get a word in, is not only nonsense, but it indicates to me it's not so much that women talk a lot, it's that they talk more than we're comfortable with them talking.
You mean it all?
Yes, precisely because, and again, I'm big on history, I'm big on actually tracing where this comes from. This isn't from nowhere. This isn't an anomaly. It didn't just arrive one day. This has been taught for centuries, back from the founding fathers of philosophy. Apparently there were no founding mothers. And this is how we've come to where we are today. So I'm passionate about having equal levels of participation from people of all genders, of all backgrounds in our communities, represented in corridors of power, represented in terms of public voice and their stories, because I believe firmly that this is better for everyone, regardless of your age, your gender, how you identify. It's going to be better for all of us if it's not one small group of people doing all the decision making and thinking that they have to govern people on issues that they might not personally understand. Okay.
Sara.
Well, that fact, or that fake fact that you read out, it kind of sounded like something you'd read on a Libra pad. You know, there's things that you read, like some of them are ridiculous. But I think it's really interesting what you were saying about, the fact that men do end up speaking more than women. And I mean, can I just get a bit of noise from the women in the crowd today? Can I get some noise? If you're a woman, make some noise. Yeah? And if you're a man, can you make some noise? Hey! Yeah! Okay, you guys were louder. But there's not... I mean, why aren't there more men here? We're here talking about the importance of women's voices because it's something that men need to hear more than women. And so... For those who don't know, I'm actually a spoken word poet and I co-founded the Bangsam Poetry Slam. I got into spoken word poetry because I didn't have a means to express myself. And I was feeling really frustrated as a young, visually, obviously Muslim woman. I just felt that there wasn't anyone in the public sphere that was speaking for me or doing anything that, that I could identify with or that I felt that I could relate to in the media. In fact, I always felt like, women were being brought down, like women of colour or Muslim women, especially by the Daily Telegraph. They have it in for Muslim women. And, a recent example of that is Yasmin Abdul-Majid, who was on Q&A recently with Jackie Lambie, and she said something that was her opinion. She said that she believes that Islam is the most feminist religion, and tried to back it up with facts. And her and Jackie got into a bit of a fighting match. And what happened after was unprecedented, because she got slammed by every single major newspaper. There was articles about her every single day, and so seeing her, someone who might be one of the most recent really prominent Muslim female voices in the media, getting absolutely slammed for something that she was just expressing her opinion, made people like me scared. And I was actually meant to record a poem and share it publicly on some media platform. And I said I didn't want to do it anymore because I felt scared that people were going to, just berate me or be mean in the comments. Even though I know I shouldn't read the comment section, but this isn't about me being a victim, but it's about how do we as a community come together and empower women's voices and recognise that, us as women, we should be the ones that are being the support of other women. And I think there's a fine line between, speaking for other women and being their mouthpiece. Some women don't have the opportunity to speak, but if you can give them that platform, then do it. So that's what I kind of try to do with the Bangsam Poetry Slam. We have a lot of kind of Muslim and culturally and linguistically diverse women of all backgrounds, of all ages come through, and they say things that you won't hear in the media because it's reflective of their own personal experiences. And a lot of them are trying to criticizing Islam. They're criticizing the way that those kind of patriarchal institutions have flourished, especially overseas, and how religion has been manipulated to subdue women, which it's not about that at all. It should be there to empower women. For example, Iman El-Etri is one person that's come through the Bankstown Poetry Slam, and she also wears the hijab, and she says this is what a feminist looks like in one of her poems. And it's such a simple statement, but I think that it needs to be recognised that, we are in this fight with you, and it's about, I think, holding hands and being able to recognise that at the end of the day, us women, yes, we have the ability to speak, and we also have to recognise that intersectionalism, we always say intersectional feminism, but what are we actually doing to make that happen, and to allow women to actually speak, to allow women to make their voices heard, and to allow women to change the political sphere, to change the social sphere. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Pardon me. Thank you all for that. There's a question that leapt out to me, and Sara, you kind of started it by getting the women in the room to call out and the men, and I heard one man say, "We're outnumbered." And the question I had written down to ask you is, in fact, very apropos of that. Why, when women tell of their experiences, do men often feel excluded or defensive? And why, if a panel like this or a conference has the word women's in the title, do so few men come? What is it that men fear about listening to women's voices? Because I think we have to admit that they wouldn't avoid them if they weren't afraid of them. So what are they afraid of?
I think it starts with a discomfort about being in a predominantly female space. Because there is such male structures in society, men are accustomed to being in either predominantly male spaces by number or predominantly male spaces by power. The Gina Davis Institute did some great research on this, showing that in crowd scenes of most movies, only 17% of people in crowd scenes are women or girls. So it is confronting for men to walk into an environment like this because it doesn't happen that often.
So it's just unfamiliar.
I think it's more than that, but I think that's the starting point.
Yeah, I think the normalization of male-dominant groups is something that we see visually in media and pop culture. It's something we see in the front pages. And of course, we talk about things that impact our communities and are hugely important in our communities as women's issues, if they have to do with domestic issues or childcare. Of course, these are everybody's issues, but we call them women's issues, and we still corral women who are thinkers, women who are writers, women who are activists into that women's issues basket. As a crime writer as well, I can attest to the fact that, in publishing, they believe that men and women will buy books by male crime writers. But if you're a woman crime writer, only women will buy those books. And that's not strictly speaking true, but it's still statistically very largely true. And that's why you'll see like initials, you'll see J.K. Rowling, P.D. James, and this sort of thing. There's been, and it starts very young for a lot of boys, they're told not to read stories about female protagonists. They're told that those stories about, women's issues are not for them. I don't want to let them off the hook and say they shouldn't be bloody interested. They shouldn't be bloody curious, they should be. But it's also, it's something that's ingrained culturally from a very early age.
Okay, so that leads me to ask all of you, do you think that what we fear is the feminisation of boys and men, that in fact to be a man is not to be a woman, and therefore we have to have this rigid boundary? And when we ask, because if you're watching a film or you're reading a book with a female protagonist, you are asked to empathise, you are asked to imagine yourself into that person's life. Do we have a visceral fear of doing that with men?
I think there is still a fear. I mean, the worst thing you can call a man is, these are female words, pardon my language, but cunt is the worst word, not, dick or something like that. If you're going to put down a man, it's not going to be about the fact that he's male, except in so much that he might not be male enough. you usually are going to use language that's associated with femininity to put a man down. And this is also why, men who are gay or who don't identify as straight, sort of hetero guys get a lot of abuse, and they get beat up just as women who don't identify as hetero women do. So there's an issue there to do with feminization, but I do also think that at its core, male is still regarded unconsciously, at least, and perhaps even overtly, as the universal, and woman is the add-on, or the extra.
Yet they have residual nipples.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But it's woman, but man is there in everything.
It's his story.
Mankind, humankind. So there's still a central position which is masculine. The woman is the other, and therefore it's only of interest to that special. We're like a special interest group, which is more than half of the population.
And even kids pick up on that. My daughter said that the other day about man versus woman, and just briefly picking up on the raising of boys issue, which I think is very important. Our son doesn't want to watch what he calls chick flicks, even with a feminist mother and a feminist father. So we really have to break it down for him and say, they're not chick flicks, they're stories. You shouldn't feel like it's any less of a story because your sister wants to watch that compared with the shoot-'em-up films that you want to watch. And it is about that fear of raising boys to be effeminate. And we have to have these conversations with our friends who have boys to say, look, do you think you're raising your boy the right way by saying, don't cry, be a man? I don't think that's a good thing. I think there's a better way of doing it.
But you mentioned chick flick, which is kind of okay as a term, but we don't have dick flicks, right? Or if you do, it's kind of a different thing.
Yeah.
But and this is sort of, we have to make a specialty kind of language. We've got to specify the femaleness of it so men won't accidentally watch
Warning,
it.
warning, this is about girls, don't buy.
So
Seems to be
this
what we're
starts
doing.
really, really young though, and we've got to be really aware of the kind of cultural gatekeeping that happens because I don't believe it's inherent in children to have these feelings. So I taught writing to really little kids for many, many years, and something I and my colleague noticed is that girls tend to write stories, creative writing stories, about 50% of the time with female protagonists and about 50% of the time with male. And that's it, the characters might be dragons or squirrels or whatever, but the pronouns are male or female. Boys, I was doing this work for 5, 6, 7 years on and off. One boy in that whole time and hundreds of kids had a female protagonist in his story. They're just not imagining themselves into that space. And it's not because they're natural little sexists or they don't think girls can be in stories. They listen really eagerly when girls stand up and tell their stories and read them out. Kids start off telling stories, copying from the stories that they've been told. And when you look in a bookshop, or often in the library of sections too, you do have these books that have quite gender-neutral covers, and so they have boy heroes, and the girls are quite welcome to borrow them and read them, and in fact are encouraged, and in fact are really you go girl, reading adventure stories and pirate stories and stuff. And then there are these books that are pink. There's nothing wrong with pink. I think it's totally fine for a girl or a boy to embrace pink. But if they're also getting these messages like boys don't cry and boys like these colours, the clothes on sale in Target and all these different angles, even if they really, really think they would love this particular story, they're not going to pick up from the school library and walk around with a pink covered book.
Yep.
And we need to be looking at all this messaging all the time and thinking of why are we even marketing books to really small children, 4 and 5, in terms of girls and boys, instead of some kids really love animal stories and some kids love space stories and some kids love pirate stories, instead of girls' stories and boys' stories, even when they're this big and they haven't even got these ideas and it's adults imposing them.
Sara, do you have something to add to this?
I don't think it's so much a fear as it is just being uncomfortable. And I don't think men are comfortable with the idea of saying that they're feminists. And, I've heard it a few times, men will say, oh, don't give me that feminist crap. And that's a valid thing to say. And actually, I was just thinking about when we had Julia Gillard as Prime Minister, she, I think, was the only Prime Minister that was ever really kind of berated for her private life and not having kids and sexualized in cartoons and that kind of stuff. And all that stuff, and it's really insidious and it creeps into all the things that we think as children growing up about women's roles in society and about women dominating in society. And so I think there's just an uncomfortableness about women being prominent, about women having economic freedom, which is really why we've been able to kind of speak out. And so in countries where there isn't economic freedom, there isn't that ability for women to have the agency and to have the freedom and the power to speak out, to sit on a panel. So yeah.
Just adding to the sort of idea of the normal being this space where, you know, if it's background groups or the protagonists, it's largely male skewed. There was a very interesting study that came out a few years ago from California, from the university there, and they looked at groups and they found that when women were 1/3 of a group, the men in the group thought they were more than 50% women. Now, that's not consciously, you know, that's right. They're not consciously trying to be, it's not sort of sexism consciously. What's happening is they're not used to those spaces. If you have even 1/3 representation, there's loads of women. They're everywhere. You know, they're taking over. And they, you know, there's change happening. There's a sense of change. And every time that number changes by a percentage point, there's tension about that. You know?
Anxiety.
That's it. That fewer than 1 out of every 4 people we hear from or about in the media, you know, that's unfortunately stalled for the last 10 years. It stayed that way. But in 1995, it was 17%. And now people go, oh, there's lots of women in the media. They're everywhere. We hear the voices constantly. There's been that little, it's snuck along, not even 10 percentage points in 2 decades. But there's still this sense like they're everywhere. What are the women complaining about? And that's why I love data. I love data, I love pie charts, I love research, and I love endnotes. Because the only way that you can challenge people's biases, including your own, you know, if I hadn't read all this research and seen it for myself, maybe I would be swayed if someone said, but there's women everywhere, you hear that, you know, and rattles off a few names. I'd actually go, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that sense of mine is incorrect. You need the data actually to break through that bias and go, wow, I've got so used to things being skewed that I don't even notice it anymore. It's become baseline.
Do you think, I've thought this for a while, so I may as well state it straight up, that men are people and women are women? You sort of said that. I always remember the best example I ever saw was a photograph on the front of the Sydney Morning Herald just a few years ago when Mubarak was toppled, and that was the demonstrators in Tahrir Square that did it, and it said, people topple Mubarak. And I, being a feminist, and feminism, what's great about it is it makes you look at things differently. I looked at that photograph very carefully and I looked for female faces. And in the faces of the crowd of hundreds and hundreds of people, there were about 9 female faces. And I thought to myself, if those proportions had been flipped, if there'd been hundreds and hundreds of women and 9 men, the headline would never have said, people topple Mubarak. It would have said, women topple Mubarak. So do you think the problem is that we still, all of us have these biases, don't really regard women as fully human? Men are still fully human. Women are somehow not quite men.
Oh, I think absolutely. I think that universal thing is there, and women are that, you know, it doesn't matter, it would seem to me, it doesn't matter what religious background you have, what historical sort of material you've been exposed to, there's elements of this everywhere, women as a special, separate group. And I've seen that across cultures. Yes, there are some exceptions, and there's certainly a lot of problematic interpretations of that, but it's been really present as an idea for centuries, you know, kind of around the world, around the globe.
Well, wasn't it debated, and I think the fact that it was debated is also debated, whether women had souls in the Protestant church in the 1800s. They had a debate then. Thanks, guys. Played God and decided whether or not
I
they
think
did.
part of the thing too, though, is in really public roles, like thinking of something like politics. So Australia has never, ever really gone much over 30% representation of women across all our parliaments. And for quite a few years after women could stand for parliament, there was no one, and then there was sort of one woman at a time, and then she'd be replaced. And that was in all the states as well as federal. And we're always sort of at the highest, hovering around 30%, which is what the UN says is sort of the minimum to be able to have any kind of, you know, they don't word it like this, but basically any kind of right to even say you have women having any kind of say in your democracy is about 30%. So we kind of just hang in there. But we're still in an era of firsts. We just had in our last parliament the first Indigenous women federal MPs. So it's still something people are commenting on, because there are still, you know, our first female defence minister we just had, and the first this and the first that. And until we get to this really meaningful bulk of numbers, like around our actual representation of 50%, and within that wider representation of the various groups in the community as well, it's going to be this constant, because it's still a novelty, this constant calling out of the first this and the first that, which really, you know, it's often meant in a spirit of celebration, and we do need to celebrate these wins when they happen, but it does other women again, because it's kind of like, here's a parliament and here's a woman in this role. Here's a group of women and here's an Indigenous woman. And it's this otherising that kind of adds to that thing too, that here's the norm and here's the special one that we're going to celebrate. And it, you know, it is difficult because we want to celebrate it, but on the other hand, we also would have really got past that till we just see a bunch of politicians.
As well as the otherising, we often see women described in relation to others. They can only be a full human being if they are the mother of someone, or the daughter of someone, or the sister of someone. And that's what we see playing out in the media even now. You know, mother of two becomes CEO. You never see father of two becoming CEO. So we are allowed to be full human beings if we're in relation to others, preferably in caring roles, and we're allowed to have our voices as mothers on women's websites talking about family issues. But when it comes to being whole human beings, having an opinion, we are still restricted.
I remember being on Q&A for an All About Women session. Tony Jones was the moderator and everybody else was women. And we got one question about the Iraq War, and everything else was vagina, 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 vagina.
Because it's the only thing we can talk about. But interestingly, like from 2012, the data that came out of the US election there, I often bring this up, it was done by Fourth Estate. So yes, when you get a bunch of women together, we're going to talk about, you know, birth control and the fact that we're women in this biological different way and the things that women can talk about. Apparently we don't do anything else. But even so, on a full national scale or an international scale, when we're talking about those issues, those things we'll call women's issues for a second, it's still men's voices that vastly outnumber women's. And you could see this from the 2012 US election. I haven't got the data yet on the latest election, which will be very interesting indeed, but 6 months of election coverage across all print, radio, and television media, across the board, so not from one political group or another, across the board, across the US for 6 months. 81% of the statements made about abortion, which is a very touchy topic in the US, particularly in that election, 81% of statements were made by men. Women only were 12% of the statements made on that topic, and the rest were organizations. So women actually only had 12% of the say on that topic, and that continued across birth control, Planned Parenthood, even the basic issue of women's rights. Men had more quotes about that general topic of women's rights than women did in 2012 across 6 months of all media.
Which brings me to the last question I'm going to ask before handing over to the audience. What are the consequences for women in having their voices not heard and not listened to? What happens to us as a result of that? Sara.
I think that what happens is what's happening right now. We have these crap statistics. You know, even for example, the law firm that I'm working at, we're heralded as like this amazing, like, you know, I think we've won for like 7 consecutive years. A leader in for women in the workplace. So I work at Allen's, and the partner kind of breakdown, men versus women, and of course, like you can only see it in relation to men, but it's something like 30%, and they're working towards the 40%. And so this is something that is like groundbreaking, and you know they only had introduced female partners a few decades ago, and we're not even at 50%. And 50% would be amazing. Why not 60%? Why can't, you know, that balance, What would flip it?
Would 50% get? How would it change things? What would change?
Well, just to drop something in quickly, one very obvious thing that I know would change, if all the studies around this are correct, and I suspect they are, is that when women are at the table, if there's 1/3 to 50% or more, those women speak more and are interrupted less often. When you just have a woman in the room, which is really important to get women in the room, it doesn't mean they get the chance to speak. It doesn't mean they get equal speaking time, and it doesn't mean they don't get interrupted a lot. And we found also with Q&A, all these women were online talking about this stuff going, hang on, it seems to me that women get interrupted a lot on the show, and there's not as many of them. And we're told it's in our heads and it's nothing, and we're getting gaslit, being told that, you know.
Crazy.
Is it crazy? Anyway, the ABC actually researched this and found out from their own research that that is true. Women are getting interrupted more often, not getting as much speaking time, and there's fewer of them. So what would 50% do? I can't say exactly what different decisions will be made, but women will be more involved in those decisions.
And there'll be different, hugely different decisions in every field, and that's right, we can't even imagine what they are. But if you look at something like medical science and research, for a great bit of history, women pretty much didn't have clitorises. They pretty much didn't exist, or no one thought they were very important. And you know, that's a pretty important thing to miss. But also, it's
stats
only
on heart disease
exactly.
from
I was
men.
about to say, it's really, really recently that we found out that women often have incredibly different symptoms if you're having a heart attack. And we've all been told all the warning signals for a heart attack, and there's women dropping dead because they don't have those symptoms. Because all the studies and research was done on men in the lead up. If you don't know this, look it up, women, of what your symptoms are for a heart attack, because it's not necessarily going to be the pain in the left side and the shortness of breath. It's something different. And we're literally losing all these women because the studies were all done on men's bodies, and there was no women in those rooms to stand up and actually say, hey, do you reckon we could have a few female research subjects in here? Because you never know.
It's really interesting that you make that point, because gender inequality is a spectrum disorder, right? So raising the voices of women, as Em says, can save lives. Think about those women's silence behind the doors of their homes, getting the shit beaten out of them and no one listening to them, and dying or being seriously injured. So raising women's voices can save lives. It also makes for better decisions at the boardroom table. Diversity makes for better decisions. Who knows what kind of world we could have if we had 50% of women's voices.
And just one final thing, of course, the fastest growing group amongst the homeless are women over 55, and this is because there were no women at the table when we designed the workplaces, superannuation, all those kinds of things. So it leads to women being poor in their old age and desperate and suiciding. So the consequences are dire for women.
And speaking of dire consequences for all of us, I just want to do one little stat bomb, another little stat bomb. I love my stats. According to independent watchdog Freedom House, and this is where I get really passionate about the need to have this diversity of voices, of 24 peace negotiations from 2000 to 2011, more than half featured women's participation of 5% or less. And in 9 of these, there were no women present at the table, right? How are we going with peace? How's that working out? Do you think we can just try something a little different?
Because you never know.
Can we try? Because we actually don't know what it would look like. We don't know what it would look like if it was largely women at the table. And I'm not even advocating for that, even just 50%, right? But we don't have that. We've never seen it. I think it's worth giving it a shot. I really do.
Survey just came out that said countries where men and women are treated more equally are safer and less violent.
It's true.
For everyone.
That's right.
So that's another reason to do it. Okay, over to you. If you have a question, because you are in the dark, please come up to the microphones. I know that can be a little bit scary, but remember, women's voices speak up. Live this shit, ladies. Get up and ask a question. You're first.
Hi. I found my feminism at university, and sometimes it was in spite of my teachers, but I think we need to accentuate, and I'd like the panel's opinion on that, how we need to force quotas through the universities so we have females at every single level. And I'm afraid to say that we don't here. And I don't think we do anywhere. And I really think that if we don't teach, women to speak up, how are they ever going to do it? And one really salient, you love facts, one really salient fact I got out of a guest lecture, a lady who lectured all over the world, and she came and she said she did an experiment once, and she put a video camera on herself while she was lecturing. And she caught herself looking at men more than 50% of the time. In fact, more than 80% of the time. She tended to pick out male faces in the audience. And she said she wasn't, even when she tried really, really, really hard, it was difficult. because it was so ingrained.
Thank you. Who would like to comment on that question? Sara?
I feel like I've talked a lot.
No, not enough. I think that, I mean, I totally agree. Education is super important. And maybe we can learn from other countries. Like I know in Iran, for example, 70% of engineering and science students are female, you know? Maybe it's just a matter of putting more scholarships out there, you know, having more prospects after, because I think the hardest thing when you're just coming out of high school and you've got this ATAR is like, what am I going to get a job in? You know, and a lot of the industries here, construction, engineering, and science, they're really male dominated. Of course, it seems to be like, unless it's teaching or something like that, those kinds of spheres are really male dominated, and males are the ones that are at the top of the board. And I think that if more women are coming out to schools, for example, and speaking about their experiences.
What about the Q word? What about quotas?
Quotas.
Let's get to the nitty gritty.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean,
It's fair enough. It's a reasonable
yeah.
answer. You don't know.
yeah.
I think we need
don't
more
know.
quotas in universities,
Yeah.
not for enrolments, which is really, we've got a very curious thing happening in Australia where there are more university graduates who are women today than there are who are men. But the starting salary for them when they go out to the workplace is lower. So we've got the pay gap starting immediately. And particularly with part-time lecturers. My husband is in university system and I'm a PhD student at the moment, and I see this everywhere and they're talking about it often. So, you know, there's a lot of women who have been in academia for a long time and they're not getting up into those really high ranks. And they're ending up having to drop out, or they get frustrated because they're on casual rates, and it's very difficult. So, and we don't have a lot of vice chancellors who've been women and this sort of thing. And that's like long-standing kind of issue, because a lot of the, you know, our best universities, and some of them really are the best, they're old sandstone traditional universities. So they come from a past where women weren't supposed to be there at all.
And actually picking up on that, I think women do need more flexibility. You know, I know
I actually think men do.
Yeah.
It's time men started doing shit at home.
yeah.
You know, sick of women having more flexibility.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
We're flexible, so flexible, we've bent ourselves inside out. Blokes, time to start doing your stretching.
I agree.
I'm dying to ask you about quotas, Tracey.
We need quotas everywhere. That's always been my opinion. The research backs it up. In universities, definitely. Our friend Jenna Price talks about that. She teaches at UTS. She's frustrated by having a 90% female journalism class full of good girls who never put their hands up because they've been brought up to be nice and sweet and polite. She sees her other female academics, because they don't look like the grey-haired men with glasses, missing out on promotions because of that really masculine power structure within a university. So it works at both levels. But we also need quotas in the media for quotes. Bloomberg has put in this tremendous quota for quotes where they must have a woman's voice in every story. Now, that sounds pretty tiny, but we're talking about finance where 70% of the voices are male. So to even have one woman's voice in every story is a way forward. The BBC's going to have 50% of women on air by 2020 across all of their programs on radio and television. It is the only way to shake things up.
Emily?
Yeah, I'm 100% for quotas because they give some kind of measurable thing to aim for instead of just good intentions and big statements about supporting diversity. And once those women are in place and other underrepresented groups, depending on the industry, are in place, then, you know, hopefully down the track those quotas aren't going to be needed because those better decisions will be made and people will be hiring in different ways and making different kinds of decisions. And I just wanted to pick up too on what Sara was saying, a lot of the STEM fields in particular that are still so male dominated, that yes, quotas of course, especially in hiring, because it might not be universities that are the problem, but also really having scholarships and supporting those kind of networks to get women through. And I want to speak sort of more on the working class side of it too as well, in the trades and the construction industry in that one. I'm married to a tradie, to a plumber. I could literally count on my two hands the number of female plumbers in New South Wales. I think I can count on one hand the number in Queensland. This is one of the higher paying trades. It's a really huge industry where there's always work. And there are no women, and it is, I think, frankly terrifying if you're going in as an apprenticeship as a teenager, and you could well be the only teenage girl in the state going for that kind of job in a male-dominated industry, and that there needs to be some kind of organised network of women to support those girls through and those women through, because that is never going to change just from the odd bloke here and there going, how about I give a girl a go? Because she's still going to be completely isolated, and it's going to be generations and generations, if ever, before that ever changes. You need the network, you need the support there, and you need the structure around that to actually make that work.
And if we doubt the efficacy of quotas, I think we have to remember that for 2,000 years there was 100% male quota for all educational institutions, all jobs, all political power, all army positions. Every power position was 100% male quota, and it has benefited them enormously, as we can see by how hard it is to change it now. So don't give me the fairness argument, I will demolish it. Do we have time for one more question? We have 3 minutes. You've been waiting patiently.
I think that.
Oh, this person was first. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 questions. Be brief.
On the subject of men's engagement with women's experiences, a lot of times when I see women in pop culture, be it movies or television, my female friends will look at those characters and say, oh gosh, you can tell a man wrote that, for example.
And technically, statistically, they probably do.
Yeah. And on the flip side of that, 2 of my heroes when I was very young were female characters were written by a man, Roald Dahl. That was Matilda and Sophie from the BFG. So
Great writers can write any gender.
yeah,
There's a lot of shit writers
So I
around.
wanted to know if you had examples of men who had really got it when it comes to creating female characters, or comments to that effect. Thanks.
I just think women are such amazing writers. I like the women that they write. But there are lots of great examples. Of course, Roald Dahl is wonderful, and I could name a few. But women writers are given so much less airtime. I guess I'd rather talk about them and talk about the fact that even today in the top grossing films, 85% of the writers are male. More than 90% of the directors. More than 80% of the producers. So the people who are getting stuff green-lighted. And like getting Cyber Hate up off the ground, for example, with the ABC, it was a 10-month project to try to get that thing up. And, we weren't given a huge budget. You need to get a project up that's not a book. Books are hard enough to get out. But to get a project, you need financial backing, which means you're already engaging with that whole system of what people think is merit and worthy and all that's so gendered on this unconscious level. So it's really hard for women to get their stories told, even when they've written incredible characters. And yeah, thank goodness for some of the great female characters that have been written in the past by men who had those positions of being able to get those stories out there. But gosh, we need more of them.
Shakespeare wrote great women. Dickens writes crap women. Go. Sorry, if you want to say something while this lady is...
I just wanted to say quickly, in the spoken word sphere, Omar Musa and Luca Lesson are 2 really great male spoken word artists, and a lot of their work is permeated by the women in their lives, the strong women in their lives that, aren't from different cultures. And for example, Omar Musa talks about his grandmother and how she's held their family together, and these little stories that are close to home, I think, help us get closer to that.
One of my favorite women written by a man is Wonder Woman. I love the 1940s comics, the originals. If you haven't read the originals, we're not talking about the same character. But he was a man who was very heavily influenced by the suffragettes at the time, and had, he was basically in a marriage with 2 different women, and had, one was an academic with a suffragette background, and one was a little bit more like the person at home who was that carer role. But 2 really strong intellectual women were influencing him. It was actually them who decided that Wonder Woman would be a woman. So we do have some of those wonderful characters that have broken through, but often you will find that they've been influenced by the women in those men's lives, as we should all be influenced by the people around us, especially when they have great ideas, and that was a good one.
I think this might have to be the last question. I'm terribly sorry.
Thank you for a wonderfully passionate discussion. My question follows on from what you've just discussed now. Where do you see the role of the voice of males in this discussion, please?
Interesting question. What do you think, Emily?
I think I'm quoting, I don't know the origin of this quote, but it's become very common, and I think it's a really useful one in this, is that we don't really need to be talking about making space for men in feminism. We need to be talking about men taking the spaces they're already in and making them feminist.
Yeah.
This is a woman-led movement. You know, we're talking about 50% of the population. We're only going to get 50% of the change if it's only women fighting for this stuff. Of course, we need men to come to these events to care about women's voices, to care about what's happening in women's lives, to want their sisters, lovers, girlfriends, daughters, other human beings around them to actually live in a just world. But if they are already in positions where they have all this extra power and all this extra space, they need to be talking about making those spaces more feminist instead of elbowing in space into a movement that is about women's voices.
Yeah.
Very well put.
Can I just add as well? I've had a few male mentors, and they're the ones that have actively sought me out. For example, Brian Brown is one of them. We met through poetry, and that could have been the end of it, but no, he sought me out. He got my email address, he sent an email to me, and he encouraged me to actually apply for the firm that I'm at now. And I think that men recognizing that they maybe have something to give and to actually do that. So whether it can be on a micro level or a macro level, it can be at home. It can be like, for example, my dad telling me, no, you have to get an education, you have to go work, you have to be independent. So those ideas were ingrained in me by my dad. And I think that if all men were doing that with their daughters, if all men were, trying to be mentors, not in a patronising way, but in a genuine way, I think that, those changes will start to happen as well.
In exactly the way men have mentored other men and helped them up through these industries
Yeah.
throughout ages to see women in that same way as people that they can help up through the ranks, for sure.
Exactly. I concur with what you said, Sara. I think men can be some of our most powerful allies, but I equally agree that to do that, to get true equality, men do have to give up a certain amount of power. It is not without pain. But it can also be a positive, touching on what Jane said before about greater flexibility for men at home to enjoy what women have enjoyed at home, those aspects that we do enjoy for many centuries. So they can be our allies, but, really power has to be taken.
There was a great little story I was told by someone I would consider a senior feminist to me, who's in publishing and has been around for a while, and she was speaking out, and she told me this story. She said she was at a publishing conference when they were talking about the copyright issues, and it was a pretty heated discussion, and it was a panel of all men and a mixed audience, and they kept taking questions from the men, and she had her hand up, and it wasn't getting chosen. The men around her kept getting picked, and she kept her hand up, and then she said, Tara, honestly, usually by now I just put my hand down. She was just like, oh, I couldn't be bothered. And then she said, but I was reading your book, and I thought, no, screw this, I'm going to keep my hand up. And she still didn't get picked, and the man next to her saw what was happening. He put his hand up, they picked him. He took the mic and just passed it to her.
Oh, I love that story.
So I say pass the mic. That's something we can do, whether it's as white women passing it to women of color or to people who are not being heard, whether it's as men passing the mic. When you see someone who's not being heard, whose voice matters, if you get that opportunity, pass the mic.
And go on, Sara, you have the last word.
I just said, I love that. I think that's the key takeaway. Pass the mic. Love that.
I was going to say, on that note, we now need to draw this panel to a close and thank Emily Maguire, Tracey Spicer, Tara Moss and Sara Mansour for